The dinner service was running late, which meant my feet were screaming and my patience was wearing thin. I'd been on my feet since 4 p.m., and it was nearly 11 now. The Rosewood restaurant, where I worked as a hostess and server, was one of the city's most exclusive establishments, the kind of place where old money whispered deals and new money tried desperately to fit in. On nights like this, when we were fully booked, I existed in a state of controlled chaos, smiling, seating, refilling water glasses, pretending not to notice when married men touched women who weren't their wives. It paid well enough to keep me and Marco, my 7-year-old son, in a modest apartment on the east side. That was all that mattered. I was clearing a table near the back when the kitchen door swung open, and Marco appeared like a small ghost in the dim corridor that led to the staff area. His uniform, the one I'd dressed him in for the evening, was half unbuttoned. His hair, which I'd combed so carefully that morning, stuck up at odd angles, and his face was streaked with tears. "Mommy," he sobbed, walking straight toward me, his small frame shaking. "Mommy, Daddy hit me again. He hit me in the car." The plate of half-eaten risotto I was holding slipped through my fingers. It didn't shatter. It fell soundlessly onto the plush carpet, and no one seemed to notice. Not the couple in the corner, not the 3 businessmen at the table near the window, not the sommelier gliding past with a bottle of Barolo. But someone noticed. I felt it before I saw him, a shift in the air, a sudden gravitational pull that made every nerve ending in my body stand alert. My hands trembled as I bent down to Marco, pulling him against my uniform, running my fingers through his hair, searching for injuries I was too afraid to find. Baby, it's okay," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't okay. Nothing had been okay for the past 2 years, not since Marco's father, Daniel, had decided that anger was a love language and control was devotion. He said I was being stupid. Marco whimpered into my chest. He said I was being stupid when I didn't want to go to his apartment. And then he hit me. "Mommy." He hit me on my shoulder. I felt the rage rise in me like a wave, hot and consuming. It mixed with the fear that had become my constant companion. I pulled Marco's shirt aside gently, and there it was, a red mark, already darkening into something deeper, something that would become a bruise. "Okay," I breathed, pressing my forehead to his. "Okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. You're with me." It was a lie wrapped in a promise. I had no idea how to keep him safe. I had a restraining order against Daniel that he ignored whenever he felt like it. I had a job that barely covered rent. I had a 7-year-old who was learning that the world was dangerous, and that the man who created him was the danger. "Signorina." The voice cut through my spiraling thoughts like a blade through silk. I looked up from Marco's shoulder, and time did something strange. It slowed. It contracted. It reorganized itself around a single point. The man standing 5 feet away from our table, his gaze fixed entirely on my son. He was tall, not just tall, but broad in the way that suggested he occupied more space than other people, that the world bent around him rather than the other way around. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, and it moved like water as he approached. His hands were large, his fingers long and elegant, and there was something about the way he held them loose at his sides but radiating controlled power that made my breath catch. But it was his face that stopped me completely. He was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with conventional features. His bone structure was sharp, aristocratic, vaguely Eastern European or Russian, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held an intensity that suggested he could see through skin and bone, directly into the things people tried to hide. "Is the child hurt?" His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. He wasn't asking, he was interrogating. I stood up, pulling Marco protectively against my leg, suddenly aware of how small I must look to him. My uniform was wrinkled. My hair was falling out of its bun. My name tag read Elena in slightly faded letters. "He's fine," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Just upset." The man's gaze didn't waver from Marco. "The child does not appear fine. He appears to be in pain." Around us, I could feel the restaurant's attention fragmenting. A few people were looking now. The couple in the corner had paused mid-conversation. The businessmen had gone quiet. "It's a private matter," I said, and I heard the desperation creeping into my tone. The last thing I needed was attention, involvement, questions. I needed to take Marco somewhere quiet, ice the bruise, lie to him about everything being okay, and survive another day in this nightmare I'd somehow created for both of us. Someone hurt the child, the man said. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone used to having his observations treated as law. A man, based on the size and force of the mark. The father, according to what the boy said. My stomach clenched. He'd heard Marco. He'd heard everything. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for. Please don't get involved. Please don't make this worse. Please tell me there was a way out of this trap I'd been living in for so long that I'd stopped believing escape was possible. The man shifted his weight, and I became aware suddenly, sharply of the fact that there were other men with him. 3 of them, standing at a discreet distance near the bar, dressed in suits nearly as expensive as his, their eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of people trained to spot threats. Security, or something like it. What is your name? He asked. Elena. Elena. He said it slowly, as if tasting the word. And the child? Marco. He crouched down, not threatening but present, bringing himself closer to my son's eye level. Marco pressed harder against my leg, frightened now. The man seemed to register this, seemed to adjust his approach in real time, making himself less predatory. Marco, he said gently, I am very sorry that someone hurt you. That should not happen, ever. Do you understand? Marco nodded mutely, eyes wide. Can you do something for me? Another nod. Can you go with my colleague there? He pointed to one of the men near the bar, younger, with kind eyes. His name is Paolo. He is going to bring you some chocolate cake from the kitchen, and you can sit in the quiet room while your mother finishes her work. Can you do that? Marco looked at me, uncertain. I was uncertain too. Every instinct was screaming at me to grab my son and run, but there was something in this man's manner, a certainty that suggested running would only delay the inevitable. I nodded at Marco, and he released my leg, walking toward Paolo, like a small soldier being deployed to war. The man rose to his full height and looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were worse, up close they saw everything. They saw my bruises under my uniform, the ones I'd become expert at hiding. They saw my fear. They saw my love for Marco, and the way it was poisoning my ability to protect him. Who is the father? He asked. I can't. Who is he? There was steel in his voice now, the gentleness completely gone. He'd used it with Marco like a tool, calibrating it carefully. With me, he'd sheathed it and replaced it with something sharper. Daniel Morrison, I whispered, and the name tasted like poison on my tongue. But please, I don't want any trouble. I just need... You need, he said, stepping closer, to tell me your address. No. The refusal came out before I could stop it. I don't know who you are, and I don't... You will tell me your address, he said, and it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of future fact, spoken with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Either now, or I will have it within the hour. The question is whether you make this easy or difficult. I stood there, trembling, caught between the danger I knew and the danger I didn't. Daniel hit my son. That was a known quantity, a familiar darkness. This man was unknown. But as I watched him, as I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, I realized something that terrified me more than any of it. I was relieved. Relieved that someone had finally heard Marco cry. Relieved that someone was willing to do something about it. Relieved, against all reason and instinct, to not be alone anymore. 63 Riverside Apartments, I said quietly. Unit 4C. He nodded once, as if I'd simply confirmed what he already knew. Go home, he said. Pack a bag for you and the child. Nothing more. You will leave instructions for nowhere. You will tell no one. Paolo will come for you at midnight. You will be ready. Why would I? Because the alternative, he said softly, is that tomorrow I watch while the father takes your son again. And I let it happen. And I watch what happens next. He paused. And I do not think you want that. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the private dining room, leaving me standing in the middle of the restaurant with no choice at all, and every choice in the world, and absolutely no idea which direction safety lay anymore. Behind me, Marco sat with Paolo, eating chocolate cake. Ahead of me, midnight approached like an executioner. I didn't pack a bag. I packed two, because I was in a state of controlled panic that had somehow evolved into hyperfunction. My hands moved on autopilot, throwing clothes into a suitcase, Marco's favorite sweaters, his stuffed rabbit, the one photo of him that made him smile. My own belongings seemed suddenly irrelevant. I'd been reduced to my function, Marco's mother. Nothing else mattered. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom that I'd converted into a studio by moving the double bed I shared with Marco into a corner, claiming the actual bedroom as both our refuge and my closet. It was 11:47 p.m. I knew this because I'd been staring at the clock for the past hour, watching the minutes die. Marco was asleep on the couch, curled around his rabbit. I'd given him a dose of liquid acetaminophen for the bruise, which had continued to darken. It was an ugly plum color now, the kind that would raise questions at school, the kind I'd have to lie about. He'd fallen asleep mid-question, his small body surrendering to exhaustion. At 11:58, someone knocked. Not a police knock, not an angry knock, just a quiet, professional knock that suggested the person on the other side of the door had knocked on thousands of doors and would knock on thousands more. Paolo stood in the hallway, no longer in the suit but in dark jeans and a black leather jacket. He looked younger somehow, and sad in a way that suggested he'd helped women and children flee before and it had never ended the way anyone hoped it would. "You're ready?" he asked. "I don't even know where I'm going," I said. "It's better that way," Paolo replied, and he said it with such finality that I didn't bother asking again. I carried Marco to the car, a black SUV with tinted windows that looked like it belonged to people who wanted to disappear. Paolo loaded the bags into the trunk while I strapped Marco into the back seat, careful not to jostle his injured shoulder. He woke briefly, confused and frightened, but the car ride and the hum of motion seemed to soothe him back towards sleep. We drove in silence. The city transformed outside the windows as Paolo navigated us away from my neighborhood. The streets went from residential to industrial to something else entirely, a part of the city I'd never been to, where warehouses stood like sleeping giants and the buildings got progressively more upscale. We turned onto a street where the homes were mansions, set back from the road, guarded by gates and darkness. Paolo pulled through one of these gates, and it closed behind us with a soft, decisive click. The house revealed itself slowly as we drove up the curved driveway. It was enormous, 3 stories, stone and glass, modern in the way that wealth could afford to be. Lights illuminated the grounds, and I caught glimpses of manicured gardens, a fountain, a glimpse of what looked like a pool in the back. "This can't be right," I whispered. "It is," Paolo said. He opened my door. "Come on." I extracted Marco, who was now fully awake and staring at the mansion with the wide eyes of a child confronted with something that didn't fit his understanding of how the world worked. A woman appeared at the front door, older, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "I'm Margot," she said. "I manage the house. You must be Elena. Come in. You must be exhausted." I wasn't exhausted. I was electric with anxiety. My mind kept spinning through worst-case scenarios. Trafficking, kidnapping, a beautiful trap designed to separate me from my son. But Marco was already following Margot inside, his resistance worn down by the lateness of the hour and the surreality of the situation. The interior of the mansion was exactly what I expected. Expensive, tasteful, and soulless in the way that interiors designed by professionals often were. Margot led us upstairs, past closed doors and dimmed hallways, to a suite at the end of the corridor. "This is yours," she said, opening the double doors to reveal a sitting area, a bedroom, and an attached bathroom. "Marco will sleep here." She gestured to a second bedroom, off the main room. "You're here. Everything is prepared. There are clothes in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom. If you need anything, there is a phone on the nightstand. You can press 0 for me." "I don't understand," I said, because I genuinely didn't. "Who is he?" "The man at the restaurant." Margot's expression shifted into something more carefully neutral. "His name is Dimitri, and you don't need to understand. You need to rest, and you need to keep your son safe, both of which you can do here." She left before I could ask anything else. I got Marco into bed, tucking the rabbit under his arm, checking his shoulder one more time before turning off the light. Then I sat on my own bed, a king size with thread count that probably cost more than my weekly salary, and tried to process what had happened. The phone call came at 2 a.m. I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, so the sound didn't startle me. But I almost didn't answer it. Some part of me was still operating under the assumption that I could refuse, that I could somehow walk away from this. I picked up the phone. "Did you sleep?" His voice, unmistakable. "Dimitri." "No, that's acceptable. Come to the study. Margot will show you where." He hung up. I sat there for a moment, heart racing. Then I got out of bed, pulled on the robe I found in the closet, a luxury silk thing that probably cost more than my work uniform, and opened the door. Margot was waiting in the hallway, as if she'd been standing there the entire time. The study was on the second floor, a room lined with books, and dominated by a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark wood. Dimitri stood with his back to me, looking out the window at the grounds below. He was wearing a dark sweater and dress pants, his jacket discarded somewhere. "Close the door," he said, not turning around. I did. "Your son is safe," he said. "He will remain safe here. I have doctors on call, security staff, every resource necessary to ensure his health and protection." "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. He turned, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in the restaurant. Vulnerability, maybe, or the ghost of it. Something that suggested he wasn't entirely the untouchable force I'd initially perceived. "Because," he said slowly, "when a child cries in front of me, I cannot ignore it. And when a man raises his hand to his own son, I remember why I do what I do." He moved toward me, and I forced myself not to retreat. He was tall enough that I had to tilt my head to meet his eyes. "You are wondering if you're safe here," he continued. "If this is some elaborate trap. If trading one dangerous man for another is progress." "Yes," I admitted. "You are," he said quietly. "Safer here than anywhere else you could possibly be. That, I can promise you. What happens next, that depends on you, and what you're willing to accept." "I don't know who you are," I said. "I know, and I'm not going to tell you tonight. Tonight, you're going to go back to your room, and you're going to try to sleep. And tomorrow, you're going to tell me everything about Daniel Morrison, his schedule, his connections, his habits, everything. And then, Dimitri said, stepping even closer. He stops being a threat. The way he said it with absolute certainty, with the kind of finality that suggested he'd made this kind of promise before, and had always kept it, sent ice through my veins. "You're going to kill him," I whispered. Dimitri didn't answer. He simply reached out and, very gently, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was so unexpected, so tender in contrast to the darkness of what he'd just implied, that I felt tears prick my eyes. "Go to your son," he said. "He's had a nightmare. Margot is with him, but he's asking for you." I left without another word, and when I got back to Marco's room, I found him crying softly, with Margot sitting on the edge of his bed. I pushed her out gently and took her place, pulling my son close, whispering all the reassurances I'd been trained to give. But underneath the comfort I was offering, I felt it. The pull of something vast and dangerous and entirely beyond my control. The gravity well of Dimitri's world, slowly drawing us in. I'd escaped Daniel only to be caught by something infinitely more powerful. And the terrifying part was that I wasn't sure I wanted to resist. The morning came too bright, filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens I'd never seen grow. I woke to Marco shaking my shoulder, his voice small and urgent. "Mommy, there's someone outside. There's so many people." I stumbled out of bed, still wearing Margot's robe, and found him pressed against the glass of the sitting area window. Outside, the grounds of the mansion had been transformed into something resembling a military operation. Men in dark clothes moved with purpose, checking gates, inspecting the perimeter, installing cameras on poles that hadn't been there before. Security, or the machinery of war, depending on how you looked at it. "It's okay," I told Marco, pulling him away from the window, though we both knew it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. But he was 7, and he was learning that his mother lied when it mattered most. "It's just extra people, to keep us safe." He accepted this with the peculiar facility children had for accepting the unacceptable when adults framed it carefully enough. Breakfast appeared as if by magic, Margot materializing with a cart full of pastries, fresh fruit, coffee that smelled like it had been imported from somewhere expensive. Marco ate with the appetite of a child who'd been living on convenience store food and my meager salary, and I watched him with a strange mix of relief and guilt. He was safe. He was fed. He was in danger from something worse than starvation. "Dimitri wants to see you," Margot said quietly, after Marco had been settled in front of a television with cartoons and a plate of berries. The study. Now, I'd changed into clothes from the closet designer jeans and a soft sweater, things that felt like costumes of a life I wasn't living. Margot led me through corridors I didn't remember from the night before, and I realized I was being deliberately disoriented. This mansion was designed to be labyrinthine, to keep people in their designated spaces, to remind them that they were guests in someone else's world. Dimitri was on the phone when I entered the study, speaking Russian in a voice so low and dangerous that I actually took a step backward. He held up one finger weight and continued the conversation for another 30 seconds. Whatever he said made the person on the other end comply immediately. I heard the click of the call disconnecting. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. I sat. "Tell me about Daniel Morrison," he said, pulling out a tablet and some kind of stylus. "Everything. Don't edit for relevance. Just talk." So I did. I told him how I'd met Daniel at a bar 7 years ago, how he'd seemed charming and put together, how he'd paid attention to me in the way that men did when they were hunting. I told him about the pregnancy, about how Daniel had proposed, and I'd been stupid enough to think it meant something. I told him about the wedding, small and cheap, and the apartment, and the moment when his personality had shifted. It was gradual, I explained. A word spoken harshly when I burned dinner. A hand gripped too tightly on my arm when I was leaving a party. A morning when he decided I'd flirted with a barista, and the punishment that followed. And Marco had been born into it, innocent and beautiful. And Daniel had loved him in the way that men like that could love possessively, with the threat of violence always humming underneath. "The bruise on his shoulder," Dimitri said, not looking up from the tablet where he was making notes. "How did it happen?" Marco said he didn't want to go to Daniel's apartment. He wanted to stay home. Daniel was picking him up for the weekend, but Marco... I paused, my throat tight. Marco is starting to understand that something is wrong, that his father is not normal, so he resisted, and Daniel hit him. In the car outside the restaurant, in the parking lot, the server told me I should go check on him, and that's when Marco found me. Dimitri set the tablet down. "When did you last see Daniel in person?" 3 months ago. He hit me because I asked about child support. I lifted my sweater without thinking, revealing the faded yellowing of old bruises on my ribs. I got the restraining order after that. I watched something shift in Dimitri's face. It was subtle, a tightening around his eyes, a muscle in his jaw that tensed, but it was there. Something raw underneath the control. "Describe his routine," he said, his voice rougher now. "Where he lives, where he works, where he goes. Everything." I did. Daniel was a pharmaceutical sales rep, a job that gave him the flexibility to follow his whims. He lived in a downtown apartment, slept around, spent money on cars and watches, and the accessories of a man trying to convince himself he was important. He went to the same bars, the same clubs, the same gym. He was predictable in the way that men who'd never faced consequences usually were. Dimitri listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the organized chaos of his security team. "He will not contact you again," Dimitri said. His voice was conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "He will not come near your son. He will not appear in places where Marco might encounter him. If he violates this, there will be consequences that he will spend the rest of his life regretting. Is this clear?" "Yes," I whispered. "And you won't ask questions," Dimitri continued, turning back to me. "You won't want to know what I do or how I do it. You will simply accept that this problem has been solved, the way a child accepts that adults handle adult problems." "Dimitri." "No," he said. There was steel in his voice, the same steel I'd heard in the restaurant. "You don't get to ask. You don't get to negotiate the terms of your son's safety. You get to be grateful. and you get to stop being stupid enough to let a man like Daniel Morrison near him ever again." The words were cruel, but he delivered them with such absolute lack of judgment that I realized he wasn't being cruel to me. He was being cruel to himself, to the version of himself that was about to do something to Daniel that would require penance. "What do you want from me?" I asked, and I was surprised to hear that my voice was steady. Dimitri looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something pass across his face. Recognition, maybe, or desire. Though that seemed impossible, I was nothing to him but a woman with a child and a problem that needed solving. "Nothing," he said finally. Yet, he moved to a painting on the wall, abstract, all colors and chaos, and pressed a hidden panel. A safe revealed itself, and he entered a code I deliberately didn't watch. When it opened, he withdrew a photograph and handed it to me. It was a girl, maybe 12, with dark hair and Dimitri's eyes. She was laughing at something off camera, and her joy was so pure, so untouched by the darkness I was beginning to understand surrounded Dimitri, that I felt my chest contract. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Katerina. She lives in Moscow with her mother. She calls me once a week, on Sundays. She doesn't know what I do. She thinks I own businesses. She thinks I'm legitimate. Dimitri." "When a man harms his own child," Dimitri continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "it reminds me why that fiction is important. It reminds me why I do this." He took the photograph back. "Your son will be safe here, more safe than he's ever been, and you will stop feeling guilty about it." "How do I do that?" I asked. "By understanding," Dimitri said, and his voice was gentle again, that tone he'd used in the restaurant. "That sometimes the only way to save someone is to be worse than the thing trying to destroy them. And by accepting that." He guided me to the door with a hand at the small of my back, a touch so light I might have imagined it, but I didn't. My skin remembered it. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow, you'll help Margot with the house. You'll establish routines. You'll stop thinking of this as temporary." "Is it?" I asked. Dimitri didn't answer. He simply closed the door, leaving me in the hallway with the echo of his words and the growing understanding that I'd made a Faustian bargain, trading the danger I knew for the danger I didn't. And underneath it all, a strange, shameful gratitude that someone finally cared enough to be that dangerous on our behalf. By the end of the first week, the mansion had started to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, which was probably the most insidious part of whatever Dimitri had orchestrated. Margot established routines with military precision. Marco attended lessons in a tutoring room on the second floor, taught by an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who had a gift for making algebra seem like adventure. I helped Margot manage the household, learning the preferences of Dimitri's staff, the rhythms of a place designed to run without friction. Dimitri was everywhere and nowhere. I'd see him in hallways, moving through the mansion like water through a sieve, essential, but not quite solid. He'd nod at me. Sometimes he'd ask if Marco was adjusting well. Once, he brought Marco a set of model cars, expensive things, and sat with my son for an hour while Marco explained, with the earnestness of childhood, how the engines worked. It was that version of Dimitri, patient, attentive, kind, that scared me most. The news came on the third Tuesday. I was folding linens in the laundry room when Margot turned on the television that hung in the corner, the way she did every afternoon at 2 p.m. The local news anchor was discussing a hit and run on the north side of the city. A man identified as Daniel Morrison had been struck by a car in an empty parking lot and left to die. The driver had not been identified. There were no witnesses. The laundry fell from my hands. "Are you all right, Alina?" Margot asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Did he—" I couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't even formulate the question in a way that would make sense. "Dimitri does what needs to be done," Margot said simply. "That is what you pay for when you ask for his protection." But I hadn't asked. I'd never agreed to this. I'd been brought here and arranged like furniture, and now the man I'd hoped would never touch Marco again was dead, and I was supposed to feel something other than the hollow vertigo opening up inside me. I made it to the bathroom before I got sick. Marco noticed something was wrong at dinner. The three of us sat in the formal dining room, a compromise, since Dimitri had implied he didn't like eating alone, and Marco had a child's inability to understand that adults might have complicated reasons for proximity. The meal was beautiful, perfectly prepared by the kitchen staff, and I couldn't taste any of it. "Mommy's sad again," Marco said to Dimitri with the bluntness of childhood. I started to protest, but Dimitri beat me to it. "Your mother has had a lot of stress for a very long time," Dimitri said, and I watched as he cut Marco's chicken into manageable pieces. "But she is safe now. You are safe now. Sometimes people need time to believe that." "Is Daddy—" Marco started, and I felt my entire body clench. "Your father made choices," Dimitri said, his voice gentle but absolute. "And those choices have been resolved. He will not come back. He will not hurt you again, and you don't need to think about him anymore." Marco accepted this with the peculiar ease of children, returning his attention to his plate. I couldn't look at Dimitri. I couldn't bear to see whatever was in his face when he talked about ending Daniel like he was discussing the weather. But later, after Marco was in bed, Dimitri found me in the library. I was pretending to read, actually just staring at the same page I'd been staring at for an hour. He didn't announce himself, he simply appeared, the way he had a habit of doing, and sat in the chair across from me. "You're angry," he said. "I don't have the right to be angry," I replied, which wasn't an answer. "You're angry because you didn't want it done this way," Dimitri corrected. "You wanted it done magically, with no cost. You wanted to wake up and have him gone and your hands to remain clean." "Maybe," I admitted. "That's not how the world works," Dimitri said. "The world is run by people who are willing to be dirty, so that people like you can pretend they're not involved." He leaned forward. "Daniel Morrison beat a child. He beat you. He would have continued to do both of those things forever, because nothing in his life had ever taught him there were consequences. So I taught him. By killing him," I whispered. "By removing him," Dimitri said, and there was no apology in his voice. "Whether he's dead or simply gone from your life is a question you shouldn't concern yourself with." But I could see it in his face, in the slight weariness around his eyes, in the way his shoulders held tension. He'd killed Daniel, or arranged for him to be killed. And some part of Dimitri, some part I was beginning to understand ran deep, required penance for that. Not because Daniel didn't deserve it, but because Dimitri understood that killing, even when justified, carried a cost. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you do that for us? We're nothing to you." Dimitri was quiet for a long moment. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at his grounds, his empire, his carefully constructed world. "When I was young," he said, "I had a mother. She was soft, the way you are, kind. She let men hurt her because she didn't think she had a choice. One of those men was my father. He hit her. And He paused, and I saw his hands clench. I didn't stop him. I was young, I told myself. I was helpless. And then one day, she was gone. Not dead. Just gone. She decided she couldn't anymore, and she left." He turned to me. "She left me," he said quietly. "And I spent my entire life ensuring that I would never be the kind of man a woman had to leave. I built an empire so that I could make sure that if I ever saw someone in the situation my mother was in, I could do something about it. Dimitri, I don't expect you to understand," he continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me, or to feel grateful, or to feel anything but the confusion you're feeling right now. But I need you to understand one thing. Your son is not safe because Daniel is gone. He's safe because he's here, in my house, under my protection. And nothing, no one, will ever touch him again. That is not a promise I'm making lightly." He left before I could respond, closing the library door quietly behind him, leaving me alone with the weight of what he'd done and the complexity of my own gratitude. The next morning, the security around the mansion intensified. New guards arrived, men with cold eyes and weapons visible under their jackets. Dimitri's phone rang constantly, conversations in Russian and English conducted in low, urgent tones. Through the windows, I watched as black SUVs came and went from the driveway. Something was happening, something bad. I cornered Margot in the kitchen. "What's going on?" I asked. "There are people who wish to challenge Dimitri's authority," Margot said simply, as if this was a normal thing to discuss while chopping vegetables. "It is. Business. Nothing for you to worry about." But I did worry. I worried that I'd brought danger to Dimitri by being here. I worried that the men in the mansion were preparing for violence. I worried that my gratitude had made me complicit in whatever was about to happen. And worst of all, I worried that I no longer cared, because as long as Marco was safe, the rest of it seemed like someone else's problem. I was becoming someone new, I realized. Someone who lived in Dimitri's shadow. The attack came on a Wednesday night. I was helping Marco with his homework fractions, which he was beginning to understand when the house went dark. Not a gradual loss of light, but an immediate, total blackout that made Marco cry out and reach for me. "It's okay," I said, pulling him close, though I had no idea if that was true. "Stay here." But Margot was already in the room, moving with the kind of composure that suggested she'd prepared for this scenario. She guided us to an interior hallway, away from windows, and handed me a flashlight. "The safe room," she said. "Downstairs, third door on the left of the kitchen. Go." Now, Marco was crying, frightened, and I carried him down the stairs in the dark, my hand trailing the wall, following Margot's directions. The safe room was exactly what it sounded like, a reinforced space with its own power supply, stocked with supplies like we were preparing for a siege. Because, I realized with a chill, we were. I could hear it from inside, the sound of gunfire, muffled by distance and walls but unmistakable. Pop, 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 then silence, then more. Glass breaking somewhere. Shouts. The sounds of organized violence. Marco buried his face in my chest. "Is it the bad people?" he asked, his voice small. "No," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was a lie. "Dimitri is handling it. We're safe." I repeated this like a mantra, more for my own benefit than his. We were safe. Dimitri had built this room. Dimitri had prepared for this. The fortress we'd been living in was serving its actual purpose. The gunfire lasted maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it stopped, the silence was somehow worse, a void where violence had been, replaced by the unknown of aftermath. Marco had cried himself to sleep, and I sat in the dim light of the emergency bulbs, holding him and trying not to think about what was happening on the other side of those reinforced walls. It was Dimitri who came for us. He appeared at the safe room door, and I was struck immediately by how controlled he was. There was blood on his shirt, on his hands, matted in his hair, but his face was utterly serene. It was the calm of a man who had moved past anger into something colder and more purposeful. "It's over," he said. "You can come out." I carried Marco, who was half asleep, and followed Dimitri back upstairs. The mansion looked mostly intact, though there was evidence of the violence. Bullet holes in the walls, overturned furniture, a window in the sitting room that had been shattered. But the structure remained solid. Dimitri's fortress had held. "How many?" I asked. "4," Dimitri said, and he was already moving through the house, checking things, assessing damage. They came through the east wall. It was clumsy, poorly planned. "Did you—" I couldn't finish the question. "They're handled," he said, in a tone that suggested I should stop asking. Staff moved through the mansion, cleaning, repairing, restoring order. By the time the sun came up, the evidence of the attack was being erased, rewritten, made into something that hadn't happened in the official record of the world. Dimitri disappeared for most of the morning. Margot told me he was conducting business, which seemed to be her euphemism for whatever violence-adjacent tasks awaited him. I kept Marco occupied with lessons, with television, with anything that would prevent him from thinking too hard about what had happened. But when Dimitri came to find us that evening, I made a decision. He was in the study again, in fresh clothes now, his hair wet from a shower, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he hadn't slept. When I knocked on his open door, he looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "Elena, I need to talk to you," I said. He gestured to the chair, and I sat, trying to organize the thoughts that had been chaotic in my mind all day. "I can't stay here," I said finally. "Not like this. This is your war, not ours. And Marco, your son is safer in this house during a war than he would be anywhere in the city," Dimitri said flatly. 4 men came for me last night. They had a plan to breach the east wall. By the time they got through, my security had already neutralized them. Marco didn't hear a thing. He was in a reinforced room with you. That is how you define safety. But we brought this on you, I said. Because of Daniel. Because of us. This has nothing to do with Daniel, Dimitri interrupted. Daniel Morrison was a personal satisfaction. This, he gestured vaguely at the damaged walls beyond the study. This is business. The Castellano family has been testing my borders for years. Last night, they finally committed fully. Next week, I will respond. By spring, this will all be resolved. By spring? I echoed. Or sooner, depending on how aggressive they want to be, Dimitri said. Either way, your presence here doesn't change the timeline. If anything, it's already been factored into their calculations. So we're leverage, I said quietly. Something flickered across Dimitri's face, not denial. Exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. Your leverage, he agreed. The way everything is leverage. Your existence here matters only insofar as the Castellanos might believe I'm distracted by you. Which I'm not. It should have hurt. But instead, it was almost a relief. To be seen clearly, without the softening of fake sentiment. To understand exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of Dimitri's world. Marco stays, I said. But I want to understand what's happening. I want to know what I'm exposing him to. Dimitri considered me for a long moment. The Castellanos are attempting a power consolidation, he said finally. They want control of the East Side distribution network. I have that network. They've made offers. I've declined. So now they're attempting to take it by force, which is messier and less efficient, but some families prefer the direct approach. How long? I asked. How long will this go on? Unknown, Dimitri said. But nothing will happen to Marco. I give you my word on that. Everything he needs, safety, education, protection, he will have. And when this is over, you'll have the choice of staying or leaving. That, I promise you. I didn't believe him about the choice. I suspected that once I'd been here, once I understood what his world was actually like, leaving would never be an actual option. I would become like Margot, someone who had integrated into Dimitri's life so thoroughly that the outside world would feel foreign. I want a room of my own, I said, away from Marco. I want privacy? Dimitri supplied, and there was something almost amused in his tone. Distance, I said, from what you do, from the violence. I'll have Margot prepare the East Wing, Dimitri said. You'll be closer to the gardens, but still within the secure perimeter. Will that suffice? Yes, I said, and I felt something shift inside me, something accepting, something surrendering to the inevitability of this. I stood to leave, but Dimitri's voice stopped me. Elena, I turned. Thank you, he said quietly, for not trying to take Marco and run. That would have made this more complicated. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would be true, because the fact was, I had considered running, in the dark, hours before dawn, but I'd looked at Marco, sleeping safely in a room with backup power and reinforced walls, and I'd realized that running would take me away from the only thing that had ever actually protected him, so I'd stayed. And now I was moving deeper into Dimitri's world, establishing roots, becoming part of the infrastructure of his fortress. By the time the spring came, I suspected there would be no outside left to run to. The weeks became a strange kind of normal. Marco adjusted with the peculiar flexibility of childhood, establishing routines, lessons with Mrs. Chen, time in the library, dinners with Dimitri, where he would ask increasingly sophisticated questions about business and security. Dimitri, for his part, seemed genuinely interested in my son's intellectual development, recommending books, occasionally sitting in on lessons, treating Marco with the kind of attentive respect that most adults never granted children. I watched this relationship form and felt something crack open inside me. Not love, exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of gratitude mixed with hunger, the way a starving person might feel watching someone eat food they're not allowed to have. My room in the East Wing was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a terrace that overlooked gardens in full spring bloom. There was a reading nook, a sitting area, a bed that was mine alone for the first time in years, and it was isolating in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Dimitri's world operated in compartments. Marco was in the central fortress, cared for by Margot and the household staff. I was in the East Wing, technically part of the household, but separated by hallways and closed doors. Dmitri himself seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously: the study where he conducted business, the dining room where he occasionally appeared for meals, the hallways where I'd sometimes see him moving with urgent purpose. We inhabited the same house, but different universes. It was Dmitri who broke the distance. I was in the library late one evening. It had become my refuge, my escape, the one place I could exist without being observed when I heard the gunfire. Not the organized violence of another attack, but a few isolated shots. I froze, listening, waiting for sirens or alarms, but nothing came. Dmitri appeared at the library door sometime after midnight. He was wounded. Not critically, but there was blood on his arm, a graze wound that had torn through his jacket and marked his skin. He was moving carefully, favoring one side, and I realized immediately that he was trying not to show pain. "You should see a doctor," I said, standing too quickly, my careful distance forgotten. "Margot will handle it," he said, but he was already sinking into the chair across from me, and I saw him wince as he settled his weight. I didn't ask permission. I simply moved to him, gently unbuttoning his jacket, assessing the damage. The wound was deep but clean, and it was still bleeding. "Come on," I said, pulling him toward the attached bathroom that every room in the mansion seemed to have. "Margot will handle nothing if you don't let me help." I half expected him to refuse, to exert control like he did with everything else. Instead, he let me guide him, let me help him out of his jacket and shirt, let me turn on the light and see the full extent of the damage to his arm. "How did this happen?" I asked, running water over gauze, trying to focus on the practical rather than the intimacy of his bare skin, the breadth of his chest, the raw power even at rest in his shoulders. "Castellano family sent a message," he said, his voice almost conversational. "A sniper. They wanted to remind me that I'm not untouchable." "Are you?" I asked. "Untouchable?" "No one is," he replied. "But they will be, once I respond." I applied antiseptic carefully, watching him not flinch even when it had to burn. He was so controlled, so practiced at absorbing pain and continuing forward, that I wondered if anything could actually reach him anymore. "You should stop," he said quietly. "Stop what?" "Being careful around me," he said, and I realized his eyes were on my face, not on his wound. "You've been distant since Marco arrived, since you understood what I am, and now you're treating me like I'm someone who deserves tenderness." I finished securing the bandage on his arm, not pulling away, not moving. We were standing very close in the bathroom light, and I could see every detail of his face, the scar along his jaw, the silver at his temples, the weariness that the control couldn't quite hide. "Maybe you do," I said quietly. Something shifted in his expression. It was like watching a lock turn, revealing something underneath the careful architecture of his composure. For just a moment, he looked like the man he might have been if his life hadn't required him to become what he was. "You don't know me," Dmitri said, and there was something pleading in it, as if he was trying to warn me away and failing at it. "I know that you didn't have to help us," I said. "I know that you could have left Marco to suffer and walked away, and your life would have been easier. I know that you built a safe room in your house for people you barely knew. And I know that you just let me see you wounded, which I suspect you don't let many people do." Dmitri reached up, his injured arm moving with obvious discomfort, and cupped the side of my face. His palm was warm, his touch careful in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence embedded in his hands. "I can't offer you what you want," he said. "I can't offer you a normal life, or happiness, or the kind of security that doesn't come with looking over your shoulder. I didn't ask for that," I said, and it was true. Somewhere along the way, my hopes had recalibrated to something smaller and more possible. Safety for Marco, stability, maybe even this moment where Dmitri seemed human instead of mythological. "If I let you in," he continued, and his voice was rough now, colored with something that might have been fear if I believed Dmitri was capable of fear. "There's no going back. You'll become part of my world in a way that makes you untouchable to everyone else. You'll be the woman who belongs to me, and that will make you a target." "I'm already a target," I said. "I was a target when I was with Daniel. At least here, I'm a target that's protected." Dimitri's thumb traced my cheekbone, and I felt something dangerous and electric move through me. For weeks, I'd been managing my attraction to him by treating him as a force of nature, something to be respected but not acknowledged, the way you don't acknowledge gravity even though it shapes every moment of your life. But standing this close, with his hand on my face, and his eyes looking at me like I was the most complicated problem he'd ever had to solve, the denial became impossible. "Marco," he started. "Sleeps on the other side of the house," I said. "Margot checks on him twice a night, and he's learned not to look for me after dark." I watched Dimitri's expression shift, watched him wage some kind of internal war between caution and something that looked a lot like desire. The caution won barely. He dropped his hand and stepped back, and I felt the loss of his touch like a physical pain. "Not tonight," he said, and his voice was steady again, the armor back in place. "You're emotional because you saw me wounded. Your instinct is to comfort. That's not the same as understanding what it would mean to be with me." "And when will I understand?" I asked. "When you stop seeing me as your savior," Dimitri said, "and start seeing me as the man who ordered people to be killed. When you can look at the blood on my hands and want me anyway, not in spite of it. When you understand that you're not escaping one dangerous man by coming to me, you're choosing a different kind of danger entirely." He left me standing in the bathroom, alone, with the antiseptic smell still hanging in the air and the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my beautiful room in the East Wing and acknowledged something I'd been trying to deny. I was falling in love with him, not with the fantasy of him, not with the idea of protection, but with the real man underneath, complicated, scarred, impossible, and mine only if I was brave enough to truly be his. The question was whether I was brave enough, or whether I was simply too lost to find my way back out. Spring turned to early summer, and tension built in the mansion like humidity before a storm. The Castellano conflict had escalated beyond Dimitri's careful responses into something more open, more violent. There were more attacks on the perimeter, more nights when I heard gunfire and told myself Marco was sleeping safely in his reinforced room. There were meetings that lasted until dawn. Russian and Italian spoken in angry tones behind closed doors. There was blood in the gardens once, evidence of something that Dimitri's staff had cleaned away by the time I woke. And through it all, Dimitri was everywhere and nowhere, present and absent, treating me with a formality that was agony after that night in the bathroom. I was going mad with it. I'd spent my entire adult life being careful, being responsible, managing fear and danger, and the impossible mathematics of survival. And now I was in a house where those things were handled for me, where Marco was safe, where my only responsibility was to exist and try not to want something I couldn't have. It was unbearable. It happened on a night when Dimitri had won a significant victory. I didn't know the details, I'd stopped asking, but I could see it in the way he carried himself when he came to dinner. There was a lightness to him, a satisfaction that came from problems being solved and enemies being removed. Marco was asleep early, exhausted from a full day of lessons and garden time, and I'd been reading alone in my room when Dimitri knocked. Just knocked. Like a person visiting another person. Not like the master of the house summoning staff. "Come with me," he said, and it wasn't a command. I followed him to his private office, a room I'd never been in, a space that felt like the true heart of his fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire property, and the city sprawled beyond, glittering and indifferent. He poured 2 glasses of something dark and expensive-looking, and handed me one. "The Castellanos have agreed to a ceasefire," he said. "The immediate threat is contained. It's not over, but it's managed." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. "It means," Dimitri said slowly, "that for the first time since you arrived, your son is safe not just in theory but in practice. There are no immediate threats, no active warfare, just normalcy. Or what passes for it in my world." He was standing across the room from me, but it felt like the distance of continents. "And what about me?" I asked. Dimitri looked at me for a long moment, and I watched as the careful control he'd maintained since that night in the bathroom began to fracture. "You don't get to ask that question," he said quietly. "You don't get to stand in my office and ask about yourself when you're supposed to be with your son, raising him, forgetting about me." "I can't forget about you," I said. "I've been trying for months." "Elena." "No," I said, and I was moving before I could think better of it, before I could remember all the reasons I shouldn't. "You don't get to keep me at a distance anymore. You don't get to protect me from yourself. You did that to me, you brought me here. You showed me what safety feels like. You looked at me like I mattered. You don't get to take it back. Dmitri set his glass down with careful precision. If I let you in, he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. I will consume you. I will want to control every aspect of your life. I will become obsessed with keeping you safe. I know, I said. I was standing in front of him now, so close I could see the slight tremor in his jaw. I know all of that, and I'm asking anyway. His hand came up to my face again, but this time there was nothing careful about it. His thumb traced my lips, and I felt the touch reverberate through my entire body. Tell me what you want, he said, and it sounded like a prayer and a threat at the same time. You, I whispered, just you. Dmitri kissed me, and it was nothing like I'd expected. I'd braced for dominance, for possession, for the kind of intensity I'd come to associate with him. Instead, it was tentative, almost uncertain, like he was asking a question with his lips. I answered by kissing him back, and I felt him inhale sharply, like I'd given him permission to breathe. When he pulled back, I was trembling. Not here, he said, his voice rough. Not like this. You deserve better. He took my hand and led me through the mansion through hallways I was beginning to know intimately, past closed doors and dim lights, to a suite I'd never seen before. It was his room, I realized. His private space. Windows overlooked the gardens and the city beyond, and the bed was enormous, made of dark wood and deep fabrics. Last chance, he said, and he was still holding my hand. To walk away. To choose differently. I'm tired of choosing differently, I said. I'm tired of being sensible and careful and safe. He kissed me again, and this time, there was no tentativeness. He pulled me close, and I felt the full weight of what he was, the controlled power, the careful strength, the hunger he'd been managing for months, but underneath it all was a tenderness that took my breath away. He undressed me slowly, giving me time at each stage to change my mind. But I didn't want to change my mind. I wanted this, wanted him, wanted to be completely known, wanted to exist in a moment where there was no careful distance and no walls. When he entered me, it was slow and careful, and I felt him shaking, actually shaking, like it took everything he had to hold back from taking me the way he probably wanted to. I kissed his neck, his shoulder, and felt him exhale roughly. Tell me if it's too much, he whispered against my hair. Tell me if you need me to stop. But I didn't need him to stop. I needed him to continue, to keep moving, to take me somewhere beyond the fear and uncertainty I'd been living in. And he did, with a restraint that I realized cost him something, that required him to be less than he was capable of being. When it was over, we lay tangled together, and I felt Dmitri's hand trace the curve of my waist, his eyes never leaving my face. You're mine now, he said quietly, and I heard the absolute certainty in it, not a question, not a negotiation, just a statement of fact. That's what this means. You understand? Yes, I said, and I felt the chains of it lock around me, and I didn't care because freedom without him had been a cage anyway. He held me through the night, and I slept better than I had since childhood, safe in the arms of the man who'd become my world. The attack came 2 weeks later. I should have known better than to think the ceasefire meant peace. Dmitri had warned me, in his careful way, that the Castellanos were unpredictable, but I'd let myself fall into the dream of normal mornings waking with Dmitri before he left for business, afternoons with Marco in the gardens, evenings reading while Dmitri worked in his study, a life that looked like a life, even if it was built on foundations of violence and fear. Marco and I were in the library when Margot burst in, her composure finally shattered. Safe room, she said. Now. Move. I didn't question. I grabbed Marco, and we ran. But as we moved through the hallway, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Shouting from the entrance, the sound of glass breaking, the unmistakable percussion of gunfire inside the mansion itself. The perimeter had been breached. Margot got us to the safe room. But as she sealed the door, I heard screaming from somewhere in the house. Not guards. Not the clinical violence of Dmitri's security team. Something rawer, more desperate. What happened? I asked. my hand gripping Marco so tightly I was probably hurting him. The Castellanos didn't want a ceasefire, Margot said, her voice tight. They wanted us to think we'd won. They wanted Dimitri distracted. With me. She didn't say it, but I understood. They'd used me as a distraction while they planned something bigger. And Dimitri, who'd been with me instead of reviewing security protocols, had been vulnerable to it. The violence lasted longer this time. Hours, maybe. Marco cried himself to sleep, and I held him and tried not to think about what was happening on the other side of those reinforced walls. Tried not to think about the possibility that Dimitri was bleeding somewhere, that his fortress had failed him, that the game had changed and everyone had lost. When silence finally came, it was absolute and terrible. I was holding my breath, trying to hear something, anything, when the safe room door opened. Dimitri stood in the frame, and my heart nearly stopped. He was covered in blood. Not all of it his own, though there was plenty of that. His shirt was torn, his face marked with blood and dust, and he was holding his left side like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "It's over," he said, and his voice was rough with pain and something darker. "They're all dead. It's over." I moved to him, but Marco was already awake, crying, reaching for Dimitri despite the blood. Dimitri scooped him up with one arm, careful of his injury, and Marco buried his face in his neck. "You're safe," Dimitri told him. "Both of you are safe. I promise you." But I could see it in his face, the violation of it, the shock. They'd gotten inside. They'd penetrated his fortress. And more than that, they'd come for me. The bodies of 2 men were in the library. Evidence later cleaned away, but not before I saw them. Castellano men, with pictures of me in their pockets, with directions to my room written in Italian. They'd been coming for me. The realization that I was the lever they'd used, the distraction that had nearly cost Dimitri everything, made me sick. But Dimitri wouldn't let me spiral into guilt. He had me bathed and bandaged. I had a cut on my shoulder from something, I wasn't sure what, and settled in his bed before he finally addressed the injury to his side. It was bad. Deep. Possibly requiring stitches he was refusing to get. "Hospital," I said flatly. "Margot can." "No," I said, and I felt something inside me shift into something harder, colder. "You're going to the hospital, and you're going to let doctors who aren't part of your organization fix you. Or I'm taking Marco and leaving." It was an empty threat, and Dimitri knew it, but he was weak enough from blood loss that he didn't argue. He let me call a private physician I hadn't known existed, someone who came to the mansion with a medical bag and examined the wound with professional efficiency. "You need surgery," she said simply. "That wound is too deep for sutures." Dimitri agreed to go to a private surgical clinic, the kind of place where questions weren't asked and records weren't kept. I went with him, Marco, staying with Margot. And I sat in a waiting room and tried not to think about what it meant that I was doing this, waiting for a man to survive surgery, terrified in a way that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with loss. He was going to be fine, the surgeon told me. The blade had missed anything vital, and the damage could be repaired. He'd be in pain for weeks, movement limited for a month, but functionally intact. When I saw him in recovery, pale and drugged and vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before, I understood something that I'd been avoiding admitting. I loved him, not strategically. Not because he was protection, but because he was Dimitri, complicated and dark, and capable of such tenderness under the violence. I loved the man who would take in a stranger's child and teach him about business. I loved the man whose hands could be so careful when they weren't being destructive. I loved him completely, and it terrified me. "You're crying," Dimitri said, his voice slurred with medication. "You nearly died," I said. "But I didn't," he replied, and he reached for my hand, his fingers barely gripping mine. "Because I had something to live for. That's new for me, Elena. That's you and Marco. That's the reason I came back from that surgery." "Don't say things like that," I whispered. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it's too honest? Because it makes you understand that you've made me weak?" "You're not weak," I said. "I am now," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, just exhaustion and truth. "I'm weak because I care whether you stay or leave. I'm weak because losing you would destroy me more than a blade ever could. That's the cost of letting someone in. Elena, that vulnerability. I'm not going anywhere," I said. I know, he replied, and then the medication pulled him under again. For 3 weeks, I was both nurse and partner. I changed his dressings, managed his pain medication, helped him to the bathroom, and slept beside him while he healed. Somewhere in that time, the reality of what we were solidified. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a situation I was passing through. Dimitri was my life now, for better or worse, and I was his, in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. When he was finally strong enough to move without morphine, he pulled me close and kissed me with the kind of desperation of someone who'd nearly lost something precious. I'm keeping you, he said. Both of you. Legally, officially, permanently. I'm adopting Marco. I'm making you my wife. I'm making sure that anyone who looks at either of you knows that you belong to me. And the consequence of touching you is death. Dimitri, I know what I'm asking, he said. I'm asking you to become something other than what you were. I'm asking you to be the wife of a mafia boss, the mother of a boy he's adopted, the woman everyone will fear because she's connected to me. Are you willing? I thought about Daniel, about fear, about the woman I'd been before I walked into that restaurant. I thought about who I was becoming, stronger, harder, less willing to accept less than I deserved. Yes, I said. Yes to all of it. Dimitri smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him that wasn't aimed at Marco. It transformed his face, made him look almost human in his happiness. Good, he said, because I've already started planning the wedding. The wedding was small, which I appreciated, because I was not the kind of woman who'd ever dreamed of white dresses and flower arrangements. It was held in the garden of the mansion, at sunset, with only Dimitri's closest associates and Margot as witnesses. Marco was the ring-bearer, dressed in a tiny suit that made him look like a junior version of his father. Yes, his father. The adoption papers had been finalized 3 weeks prior, and Marco had asked to start calling Dimitri Dad within hours. The transformation was subtle but complete. Marco carried himself differently now, with the confidence of a child who knew he was truly protected, truly loved, truly belonging to someone. I wore a simple silk dress in pale gray, and when Dimitri saw me, his control cracked for just a moment. He reached for me like I was the most precious thing he'd ever held. The ceremony was brief. A judge who owed Dimitri favors pronounced us married with the kind of expedience that came from not asking questions. But when Dimitri kissed me, it was tender and public, an absolute acclaiming and a blessing at the same time. That night, he made love to me with a passion tempered by something new. Ownership. Not in the violent way I'd feared, but in the way of someone who finally had permission to want something completely. He was still careful with me, still controlled, but there was a possessiveness in every touch that thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. You're my wife now, he said, and I felt the echo of that power in his words. Officially, legally, in every way that matters. If anyone touches you, if anyone even looks at you the wrong way, there will be consequences that will echo through the city for years. I'm not afraid, I said, and I meant it. But the consequences came anyway, because this was Dimitri's world, and marriage didn't erase the rules of that world. It just changed which side I was standing on. The Castellano retaliation was swift and brutal. 2 of Dimitri's warehouses were firebombed. A convoy carrying his product was ambushed. 5 men dead before the survivors could get away. And then they came after someone closer. Dimitri's mother called from Moscow, terrified, telling him that there had been men at her apartment, men asking questions about him, about me, about Marco. I watched the fear crack through Dimitri's carefully maintained composure, and I understood something new. He loved his mother. He'd built his entire empire partially to keep her safe, to give her the life she should have had if his father hadn't destroyed their family. And now she was in danger because of me. We'll go get her, I said. That's what they want. Dimitri replied, his voice cold. They want me to leave my base of operations, to disrupt my plans, to become reactive instead of strategic. So we let them hurt your mother? We let them think they're hurting her, Dimitri said. And I watched as he shifted into something else, not Dimitri the husband, but Dimitri the strategist. We move her. We stage a scenario that makes it look like she's disappeared, and then we make the Castellanos pay for touching her. It was brilliant and ruthless, and completely logical within the context of his world, but it meant that my marriage had become a blood debt. We were connected now, and that meant we were all targets. Marco felt it, even though he was 7 and shouldn't have been able to understand the implications of what was happening. He was clingy, asked more questions, wanted to be with Dimitri constantly, as if proximity could guarantee safety. "Why do bad people want to hurt us?" he asked one afternoon, sitting on Dimitri's lap while the man reviewed security protocols. Dimitri didn't offer false comfort. He didn't lie to Marco the way I'd learned to lie to him. "Because the world has people in it who see others as problems to be solved," Dimitri said carefully. "And our family is part of a world where those kinds of problems happen. But you need to understand something very important. There is no safer place in the world than here, with me. Because I will kill anyone who threatens you. Do you understand?" Marco nodded solemnly. "That's why it's important that you're smart," Dimitri continued. "That you learn, that you understand how to recognize danger and how to respond to it. I'm going to teach you all of that. And by the time you're a man, you'll be able to protect yourself and the people you love." It should have horrified me, a 7-year-old being groomed for life in the criminal underworld. But I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that this was better than the alternative. Better than having Marco grow up soft in a world that had no mercy for softness. Better than pretending that there was a way out, a clean escape. There wasn't. There was only forward, into whatever this was becoming. The response to the Castellano attacks came 2 months later, in the form of a message delivered to the warehouse in pieces. I didn't see it, Dimitri made sure of that, but I heard him explain it to his Lieutenant Paolo. The Castellano organization was effectively dismantled. Not wiped out entirely, Dimitri wasn't that messy, but crippled so thoroughly that they'd never pose a threat again. Their distribution network was in ruins. Their financial structure had been compromised. And their primary leadership had been removed, carefully and permanently. "It's finished," Dimitri told me. And he looked exhausted in a way that suggested it hadn't been as clean or as clinical as the surface implied. "Your mother?" I asked. "Safe. She's in a villa in Tuscany. She'll stay there for a while, until things are fully settled." He pulled me into his arms. "We're safe now. All of us. It's over." I held him and tried to believe it. I knew, intellectually, that another family would rise to challenge him, that the cycle of violence and power consolidation would continue, that there would never be a moment when we were actually completely safe. But here, in this moment, with Dimitri's heartbeat against my ear and Marco sleeping safely down the hall, I chose to believe the lie. I chose to accept the shadow life we were living as the best available option. I chose him. And in choosing him, I chose everything that came with him, the darkness, the violence, the knowledge that Marco would grow up in a world that most mothers tried desperately to protect their children from. "I love you," I said, and I felt Dimitri's arms tighten around me. "I know," he replied. "That's why this works. That's why we survive." It wasn't the kind of love story I'd expected. It was darker, messier, more complicated, but it was ours, and I would spend the rest of my life defending it with the same ferocity that Dimitri used to defend us. A year later, I gave birth to our daughter in a private clinic that served the families of Dimitri's world. Her name was Katerina, after his mother, and she was born with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's softness. She was a child born into darkness, and I made the choice not to shield her from it in the ways that most mothers would. Instead, I taught her to understand it, to navigate it, to survive it. The mansion had become our home in ways I hadn't anticipated. My room in the East Wing had been merged with Dimitri's suite, expanded to accommodate a nursery that overlooked the gardens where Marco played under the careful watch of private security. Margot had become something like family, the closest thing to a mother figure I'd ever had, and Dimitri. Dimitri had become my entire world, the axis on which everything else revolved. The criminal enterprise had consolidated under his control. With the Castellanos effectively removed, and other families recognizing the futility of challenging him, Dimitri had become one of the dominant powers in the Eastern European organized crime network. Money flowed into accounts I would never fully understand. Power manifested in ways both subtle and explicit, and I'd become the wife of a man who could make people disappear with a phone call. I'd made peace with it. More than peace, I'd made a choice to embrace it, to stop asking questions, to let myself exist in the comfortable dissociation that came from not knowing the specific details of what Dimitri did. It was 3 years later when the problem emerged. Marco was 10 now, brilliant and lethal in the way that children raised with information and power often become. He understood his position in Dimitri's world, understood that his name meant something, that his presence in a room shifted dynamics, that his safety was worth more than most people's lives. He was also beginning to understand girls, which was concerning and hilarious in equal measure. But the real problem came from Dimitri's past. A woman appeared at the gates one morning, disheveled and desperate, claiming to be Dimitri's niece, the daughter of his sister, a woman he'd never mentioned to me. Margot brought her directly to me instead of to Dimitri, which told me everything I needed to know about the situation's delicacy. He doesn't know she's coming, the woman Anya explained, her Russian accent thick, her eyes red from crying. My mother is dead. Cancer. 6 months ago. She made me promise to find him, to tell him that she forgave him for what happened, that she understood why he left, why he became what he is. Dimitri's face when I told him was a study in controlled collapse. He left for his office and didn't come out for 6 hours. When he finally did, he found me in the garden with Marco and Katerina, and he looked like a man who'd aged decades in an afternoon. She's his sister's daughter, I said quietly. Her mother was dying. She came to tell him that his sister forgave him. My sister, Dimitri said, and there was something broken in his voice. Left because I became what I am. She left when I was 17 and she was 13, because she was afraid of the direction I was heading, and she was right to be afraid. He didn't ask me what he should do. He simply found Anya in the guest room and spent the evening with her, while I put Marco and Katerina to bed and tried not to think about the compartments of Dimitri's life that I'd never fully accessed. When he came back to our room, he looked hollowed out. She was already sick when my mother called me, he said, but I wasn't there. I was consolidating power, building my empire, becoming so important that I couldn't be bothered with family. She died thinking I didn't care enough to try. I'm sorry, I said, though the words felt inadequate. I'm not, he replied, and there was a bitterness to it that cut. I'm not sorry because being sorry would mean wishing I'd chosen differently, and I can't wish that. You and Marco and Katerina, you're only here because I chose the darkness. You're only safe because I became a man willing to do things that most men aren't capable of doing. He left the room, and I heard him go to his office. Heard him on the phone in Russian, making arrangements for Anya. He was giving her money, I understood. Education, protection, a new identity if she wanted it. Dimitri's way of retroactively caring for the family he'd abandoned. But the visit changed something in him. For weeks, there was a distance that hadn't been there before. He came to bed, held me, made love to me. But there was a quality of distraction to it, like part of him was elsewhere, living in a past where different choices had led to different outcomes. It came to a head on a night when we were alone, Marco and Katerina asleep, Margot attending to household business. I need to tell you something, Dimitri said, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him. Something that makes all of this. He gestured vaguely at the mansion, at us, at the life he'd built, potentially unstable. My heart stopped. There's a prosecutor, he continued. American. He's been building a case against me for 3 years. Most of it won't stick. I have layers of insulation, people who take falls, money to pay lawyers. But some of it is solid enough that there's a possibility, however remote, that I could go to prison. How remote? I asked, though I could already see the answer in his face. 30% maybe, he said. My lawyers think it's lower. The prosecutor's office thinks it's higher. And if it happens, it won't, I said. If it happens, Dimitri continued, like I hadn't spoken, you need to be prepared to take Marco and Katerina and leave, to establish a new identity, to disappear. I've already set aside accounts, made arrangements. Margot knows what to do. You would be safe, financially secure. You would be able to give them a normal life. I won't do that, I said. Elena. No, I said, and I was standing now, my hands shaking. I won't abandon you, and I won't take Marco from his father. He's part of you, Dimitri. We're part of you. You don't get to pack us away and move on. "I'm trying to protect you," Dmitri said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but I don't want your protection from you. I want your partnership. I want you to fight. I want you to use every resource at your disposal and survive this, because you have a family that needs you." Dmitri stood and pulled me into his arms, and I felt him shake. "The cost of loving you," he said, "is that I have something to lose now. I have vulnerabilities. And that makes me weaker in ways that matter. Or it makes you stronger," I said, "because you have something worth fighting for." The prosecution's case fell apart 2 months later, though I never knew exactly why. Dmitri was careful not to explain, careful not to tell me if money had changed hands or if evidence had been lost or if someone had been removed from their position. I'd learned, over the years, not to ask those questions. Life returned to something resembling normal. Marco turned 11 and asked for a motorcycle, which Dmitri agreed to teach him to ride despite my objections. Katerina learned to read in 3 languages simultaneously, displaying intelligence that suggested she would someday be even more capable than her father. And Dmitri held me at night and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving, for choosing to stay, for being willing to be the kind of woman who could love a man like him." On Marco's 12th birthday, there was a moment in the garden, the 3 of us, Dmitri and Marco and me, Katerina asleep indoors, where I watched father and son together and understood something fundamental. This was my choice made manifest. I'd chosen Dmitri and his world, and that choice had created something beautiful and dark and absolutely real. "Do you regret it?" Dmitri asked, reading my thoughts the way he always did. "No," I said, and I meant it completely, not for a second. "Even knowing what I am?" he asked. "Especially knowing what you are," I replied. Dmitri pulled me close, and over his shoulder, I watched Marco laugh at something his father said. The sun was setting, turning the sky colors that looked impossibly beautiful, and for just a moment, everything felt perfect. But I knew, even as I held on to that feeling, that there would be more violence, more threats, more complications. Because this was the cost of the life we'd chosen. The darkness was always there, lurking underneath the beauty. But so was love. So was protection. So was a man who'd learned to be human by being loved by people like me. And that, I'd decided long ago, was enough. The shadows in the garden grew longer as the sun finally set, and somewhere in the mansion, I could hear Margot checking on Katerina, could hear the quiet sounds of our fortress settling in for the night. We were safe here, for now. Protected not by innocence but by power. Not by luck but by ruthlessness. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was the life I'd chosen, and I would spend the rest of my years defending it, even if that meant defending it alongside a man whose hands had killed, even if that meant raising children who understood that the world was dangerous and that strength was the only currency that mattered, even if it meant becoming something other than the woman I'd been before I walked into a restaurant and heard my son cry. I had survived by becoming part of Dmitri's darkness, and he had survived by learning to love in the light I brought into it. That would have to be enough.